Jason Smart is a reporter with the Kyiv Post, and he's normally based in Kyiv, and today he's in Washington. Hi, Jason. Have you left Kyiv?
Yep. So I'm on leave right now, but I'll be back shortly to lovely Kiev.
When was the last time you were there, and what was it like?
I was there, I guess it was about 9 days ago at this point, days ago. And it was, Kiev is still a wonderful city. It's obviously struggling with being aerial bombardments and things like this, but the fact is that it continues to thrive as best as it can under the circumstances. And it is a very difficult situation that Ukraine is in at the moment. And you do see that reflected in the way that there's a stress in the population, I would say. And that, it's also hurt the economy. You see a lot of businesses that have gone under. But that being said, you do see that there's a resilience and a desire to keep fighting to the end.
Whatever the end may be, which is a big question, which we'll get a lot of different debate. But listen, just to start this interview off, you tweet almost constantly, and that's one of the reasons I asked to talk to you. Is it a mission of yours?
So I never used Twitter before the war, and I will delete my Twitter after the war is over. I don't enjoy social media whatsoever. I only do it because I do happen to speak Russian and Ukrainian, and so I was translating at the time texts that were coming out that I thought would be useful to foreigners trying to follow what was going on in Ukraine. And so I was simply just translating what I was reading in Telegram about different things in a couple of days, in a few days before the actual war began, or the invasion began, I should say. And since there, I just sort of kept up with it. But it is something that I consider to be, I hope, for the public service, and that it's informing people as to what's going on in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, I would say as somebody, I'm not a big social media person either, but I do follow a lot of certain people on Twitter, just because, I'll see information and post there a day before I'll see it in mainstream media. So, but having said that, it's really important how you navigate some of that social media that's being put up, or all of that social media right now, because it would appear that there's a massive information war going on both sides. Do you consider yourself a fighter on that front?
Well, I would hope that I'm putting out information that's accurate to what's going on. It is true that Russia is putting out tons of disinformation and trying to dissuade people from supporting Ukraine. And the myths that they put out, I mean, there's numerous ones that we could discuss, but the myths that they put out and the misinformation they put out intentionally to mislead people is something that needs to be combated. And the only way to combat it is to put out the truth. There's no need for Ukraine to put out anything other than the truth, because it's so overwhelmingly in favor of Ukraine. I mean, it's not Russian civilians who are being bombed. It's not Russian children who are being stolen and taken into Ukraine. It's going only one direction. Russia's killing Ukrainian civilians. Russia's kidnapping Ukrainian children, and Russia is continuing to wage an illegal war against the people of Ukraine. And that is something that is so abundantly clear to anyone that follows it. There is no Russian narrative. There's just the Russian truth, which is they are killing people. And the more that we are aware of the fact that Russia's intentions here, I shouldn't say Vladimir Putin specifically, his intentions here, do not end with Ukraine. If he's not defeated in Ukraine, I have no doubt whatsoever that this would then continue on to Poland or the Baltic states. And it looks like even in Moldova in the near future, something could happen. So the reality is that the more the public is aware of the real threat that Putin poses to global security, the better that the population of the world is able to prepare
Right, but I
itself
mean,
for
I'm
defeat.
uncomfortable. I'm uncomfortable with Biden's characterization of this as a war between democracy versus autocracy. And now that framework tends to pull in China as well, that China is on the autocracy side, the autocratic side, and that the West and NATO and the US is fighting only for freedom and democracy. I mean, it makes the solution of the conflict, it would appear, much more difficult and almost impossible.
Well, I think that, Biden did say a lot of things in the beginning, including things such as that were, I would say, he said things that were very idealistic in nature. And I think that it's changed over time. I think the focus has become much more clear.
Well,
And
I mean,
even,
he said it in, he said it in Poland. He just
he, no,
recently said it in Poland. So he continues on with that message, right?
I think that the message, though, is one that you would generally use because it's always, I mean, to be fair, I think it's to be, and to be, I mean, honest about it. I think that it's just generally how a speechwriter would generally write a speech is that you talk about light and darkness, dictatorship versus democracy. These are sort of common turns of phrase because that's what works in a populistic setting. I don't know if it's
Okay,
necessarily
but
the
then
objective.
Putin has his editorial twisted license where, you know, they're defending themselves. They are fighting Nazis. I mean, he taps into the whole Great War sentiment from families in Russia who just about every family lost a loved one or had a relative in World War II who was lost. So he taps into all of that. So, I mean, as journalists, we have to be pretty careful to walk between these narratives that put everything in black and white and melt them down to good and evil in very simple terms, right?
No, I agree with you. The fact is that populations do run on narratives, and it's easier to identify with what it is the good. And you're right. The way that Putin defines the good is being against the evil, and the evil in this case is the Nazis. And it's a narrative that the Russians have used since. It's actually interesting. It wasn't used immediately after World War II. They developed this only in the '60s of painting themselves as having this sort of a apocalyptic war with the Nazis, not the Germans, the Nazis specifically. And there's a reason for that. They were occupying Eastern Germany, so there wasn't a need to develop more hatred towards the Germans, but rather against an ideology which was opposed to communism, which was Nazism. And so that is something that they built up as being the arch evil of all times, which was defeated by Soviet communism. Now they've at this point, they no longer talk about Soviet communism, obviously, but rather the Russian people were the ones who defeated this grand evil. And so by trumping this for already 60 years, 70 years, or talking about this Nazism in World War II, they use that same narrative today to place what they're doing in the context of being the same sort of evil that was defeated a generation ago, 2 generations ago in World War II.
Tell me about your interview with the Ukrainian kind of head of propaganda, anti-propaganda, how do you want to characterize it, and what they are attempting to do, and are you comfortable with the way that they're trying to dish out information right now? Do you think it's balanced?
Well, I think it is balanced because most of it is really just sort of fact checking. I think is one of the largest things that they're engaged in, and there's a lot of things that come out, a lot of Russian narratives, and one of them, for instance, is the famous one of this grandmother who came out with a Soviet flag when the Russian troops arrived, and Russian propaganda said that, well, this Ukrainian woman, old lady, this grandmother, came out with the Soviet flag, was so happy to see these Russian soldiers arrive to rescue her. And they tracked her down and asked what was the story to her. And she said, no, not at all. She was scared. She was terrified. She had no idea what was going on. But Russia used her for propaganda purposes. And by being able to dispel that myth that Russia created, it was able to take some of the air out. And they no longer use her as an example, by the way. That's no longer used in Russian propaganda. And that is a success of the Office of Strategic Communication and Information Security, which Igor Solovey is the head of. And that office, I have not noticed them putting out anything that I would call propaganda. I think that they're putting out things that can be sourced, things that are in that are evidenced by facts. Whereas it's Russian media, generally it is, as you're very well aware, it's just narratives they sort of drum up. I mean, that the Nazis have been captured.
Well, here's another example of one of the drums, and that is that they, on the anniversary of the war, paraded a teenager who they claimed they had rescued from the Ukrainian front, and they had brought to Russia. And then the Kyiv Post, I note that they just ran a story saying 16,000 children have been deported from Ukraine into Russia. It is a remarkable number, and that's not a story from the Ukrainian side. I mean, that's been documented by all sorts of groups, and it's considered basically a war crime.
Oh, it is certainly a war crime, and the numbers are pretty astounding. And the more you read about it, the worse it gets. In the case of the children being kidnapped, I mean, Putin had a meeting last week with the woman who's in charge of the ombudsman for children's rights. So she's in charge of protecting children's.
Yeah, they always parade her somewhere, and she sits in front of the desk like she is, Mother Teresa saving children from Ukraine. Whereas the Ukrainians view she's probably the chief, kidnapper, hostage taker of Ukrainian children.
Yes. She's the ringleader of the hostage taking operation. So she is a war criminal. She's actually a war criminal, and she orchestrates the kidnapping of children and then dividing them up and sending them out across Russia's population to make sure that they lose contact with their Ukrainian roots, Ukrainian family. And that is her job. And it is disgusting. And unfortunately, you're absolutely right. They do portray her as some sort of a Mother Teresa figure doing great things to save Ukrainian children. In fact, she's engaged in the wholesale kidnapping of Ukrainian children.
You worked in Russia, and your website says that you were working for an opposition party. What opposition party was it, and what opposition leader was it?
So back when we worked in Russia, it was a long time ago already, but we were working with a number of different opposition groups. There within, we worked with this very famous now, Boris Nemtsov, Gary Kasparov, and other people who are in the opposition. And to this day, I do maintain contact and work with the groups associated with Kasparov, and others in the opposition as well. But I mean, more of
You
that
know,
faction, the Russian
the reason
opposition
I
world.
asked you, is because I was there at the same time. So kind of from
Mhm.
like from 2000 to 2010, when Putin came to power, and then he started to slowly, I use my hands like that, strangle the private media, and then they renationalized it all, and then they kind of began to handcuff and hobble the opposition. And I was there covering Boris Nemtsov and interviewed him many times, even when he ran for mayor in Sochi. And then Kasparov, I've had lunch at his house, and good friends with him in terms of covering him. And where was the hard turn that took place between Putin's kind of ability to allow some opposition, allow them off the leash a little bit, and suddenly now zero? Everybody is an enemy of the state unless they support Vladimir Putin. I mean, what happened?
So it's a good question, and when we look back at the history of this 23 years of Putin in power, I think that the turning point, the final turning point, was actually the murder of Nemtsov, which was 8 years ago, the day before yesterday, and I think that was the final turning point. It was from that day forward that we no longer saw an active opposition. I mean, there's protests the day after he got killed, or a couple of days after he got killed, but from there on out, it was just a gradual decline, and now it's non-existent. The opposition side of Russia, or an active opposition. There is people opposed to the government. There are people doing things against the government inside of Russia. But still, as political parties go, as it was in the case of himself, that's no longer the case, as you're aware. And so I think that was the turning point. I think Nemtsov's murder, which coincided, as you know, with the invasion of Ukraine, it's something that is this whole time period right there is where Putin just sort of decided he was going all out. He no longer cared about what the West said. He no longer cared about what the reaction would be. He no longer cared what the sanctions would be. He was willing to just go all out
Well, I
for
mean, there's
his.
because there was no price to pay. I mean, you could kill opposition members, you can poison them, jail them, and where's the blowback? What do you get?
Exactly.
I mean, I think probably the Kremlin may have been scared at a certain point to do these kinds of things, and then it's with a horrible shrug. They've said we can do anything we want. I mean, the Russian public will support us to do anything like that, and there's been no blowback in terms of any price that they would pay or any threat to their inner circle and power.
No, I agree with you. I think you're absolutely right. I think that's exactly it. They realized,
Don't agree
they
with me. Let's have an argument.
no,
No, I'm
no,
kidding.
but you're right. They pushed the limits, and they saw the reactions nothing. There's some strongly worded statements from one country or another in the European Union or the U.S., but in the end, who cares? And they could go further and further and further. And in the end, there's really not going to be any sort of a severe for the action. And so, why would they possibly worry about it? Why not
Not
just
going
go
to be
all
any
out?
severe reaction. Okay. Well, I mean, you're right, because they wouldn't worry about it. And I guess that brings us back to where we started on Ukraine. If there's no severe reaction, if the sanctions don't do anything, if Russians coming home in body bags don't turn public opinion, this just goes on, and there's no way to deter Putin, and there seems to be no threat to Putin or his inner circle.
I agree with you. I mean, the fact is that Putin does not fear what's going to happen domestically at this point. His highest risk is going to be something internal, such as Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner group, turning against him. There is a chance of something like that happening. But I think that he's not worried about the international community whatsoever. He knows they're scared of nukes. He knows that they're scared of the future, being able to keep the doors open or keep sort of a hope open that future economic trade will continue. But at the moment, there's not a lot of risk that he faces. He can go all out as far as he wants, and he's not worried about what will happen.
Last question to you, and I really do appreciate your time. What do you think Russia looks like at the end of this? I mean, I listened to his speech, and then I read the transcript of it on the year anniversary of his special operation, illegal invasion of Ukraine. And you know, he talks about re-enabling the military industrial complex inside Russia, like an old Soviet leader. I mean, he's just turning the whole country. And I have to admit, my sources are getting a bit thin there. The people I know that are reasonable Russians have left and gotten the hell out. He's turning the whole country into this war machine that is going to fight the West and fight liberal democracies and fight NATO. And where does this end, do you think?
The reality is that if it continues on this track, the way that I think that it will play out is this: that is Russia will continue to work with countries like Iran, North Korea, and China. Unfortunately, China is the most important one in this case, and Venezuela, Cuba. But these countries that they work with will have their own alliance. Now, this can have a couple of effects. One is the economic effect that they will be able to get off things like SWIFT, which takes away another mechanism for us to be able to sanction them or to control them or to monitor them. Because if they're not using our mechanism of monetary transfer, then there's no way for us to really see what they're up to. Now, there's a secondary thing to this as well. I think that they will continue down the path of doing illegal things as a business, as a means of having currency, because we've restricted their use of euros and dollars. So that's why we'll see an increase in the drug trade, which they are engaged in. And we know that they're engaged in the drug trade, as well as the arms trade. So I think that is one thing. I think that they truly will become a larger allied force for evil and crime in the world. Now, there's another option, though. The other way that this can go, and the way that I increasingly think that this war will end, is that I do think there will probably be a coup eventually, led by somebody who realizes not that, he's against Putin or his ideology, simply realizes it is his chance or his opportunity to seize all the power and all the money in the country. And so he will off Putin, take control, which would not be that incredibly difficult. And by doing so, he'd probably eliminate a lot of people in the Putin circle. But I think at that point, he would probably allow the defederalization of the country, that is to say, the breakup of Russia, because he wouldn't have the political or military strength to keep parts like Chechnya still inside of the Federation.
And that's what he talked about, the danger of Russia splintering. And he, of course, has put it on the West. He's not taking any responsibility for it. He's saying that the West is trying to splinter Russia and break up Russia.
Absolutely the case. And I think that is something that is really got a good chance of happening. And after all the minorities have been killed by Putin in this war, and you've seen the statistics of how many people from Buryatia, for instance, or Dagestan have died in the war, those are the ethnic minorities, ethnic Buddhists,
disproportionate numbers. Way
disproportionate numbers. And so if you're these groups, why would you want to stick with Russia? It's not the Moscovites who are dying, or the people from St. Petersburg. It's the people who they don't really care about, whether it's the prisoners or it's ethnic minorities, that Putin is happy to send off to die by the dozen.
Jason, thank you so much. Before I let you go, I have to bring your attention to the fact that there used to be a program when I was in Canada called Get Smart. And
I'm familiar with it.
You're aware of it?
Yeah, of course.
So what do you think about a parallel there? So I'm smiling, but at the same time, there's a bit of serious undertone in it, and that is that you remember the name of the evil organization that they were fighting? It was called Chaos.
Yes, I recall.
Doesn't that just sound like Putin and the Kremlin right now?
It does absolutely sound like Putin and the Kremlin. And, I think it's sort of funny is that it was, obviously the show was based on the Soviet Union as the model, right? But as time has gone on, it turns out Russia is far worse, far more evil than what is Chaos in the Get Smart series. And so I think as time goes on, we will see that Get Smart turns out to be sort of a prologue for what turns out to be in history.
Yeah. Well, Jason, good to talk to you. I really do appreciate your time, and I look forward to following your tweets on your tweets on Twitter. So you always have really clever and interesting things there. So good to talk to you. Good to meet you.
Glad you like it. Thanks so much. I appreciate it, Deanna.